In 1904, an engineer named Charles Rockwood stood at the bank of the Colorado River just south of the Mexican border and made a decision that would create the largest lake in California. He ordered his men to cut a 3,300-foot opening in the riverbank. No concrete, no steel, no headgate to control the flow. Just a raw slice through alluvial fill connecting the river to a canal that would carry irrigation water north into the Imperial Valley. Rockwood's company was nearly bankrupt. Farmers who depended on his canals were losing crops because silt had choked the older intake. He needed water moving again, and he needed it fast. A proper headgate would have cost time and money he didn't have, so he skipped it. That one shortcut, that one morning of expedience over engineering, would unleash the entire Colorado River into a desert basin 227 feet below sea level, drown a salt mining operation, submerge half an Indian reservation, and, over the next 2 years, fill a hole in the earth with enough water to create an inland sea stretching 45 miles long and 20 miles wide. Nobody planned it. Nobody voted on it. Nobody wanted it. And for a few extraordinary decades, it became the most popular vacation destination in Southern California. But the Salton Sea was never supposed to exist, and everything that followed, the glamour, the money, the celebrities, the ecological catastrophe, the children breathing toxic dust, traces back to that opening in the riverbank, carved without a gate, in a country Rockwood didn't even have clear jurisdiction over. The story actually begins in 1859, when a physician named Oliver Wozencraft looked at the dry, cracked floor of the Salton Sink and saw not a wasteland, but a farm. He'd crossed this desert a decade earlier during the gold rush and noticed something remarkable. The soil was alluvial, deposited over millennia by the Colorado River, rich, deep, and ready for cultivation, if only someone could deliver water to it. Wozencraft persuaded the California legislature to grant him rights to 1,600 square miles of the basin. He spent the rest of his life trying to fund a canal from the Colorado. He died in 1887 without turning a single shovel of dirt. It took Rockwood, a restless engineer from Colorado, to pick up the dream. He arrived in Yuma, Arizona in 1892, working for a company exploring irrigation projects along the river. The Sonoran schemes went nowhere, but Rockwood kept thinking about Wozencraft's old plan. In 1896, he formed the California Development Company, brought in a partner named Anthony Heber, and started hunting for money. For 4 years, investors in New York and London said no. The project was too speculative, the desert too remote, the engineering too uncertain. Then, in 1900, a man named George Chaffee said yes. Chaffee was a renowned irrigation engineer who had built water systems in Australia and founded the cities of Ontario and Etiwanda in Southern California. He understood desert conditions better than almost anyone alive. He agreed to invest $150,000, the equivalent of well over $5 million today, on one condition: he would become president of the company. Rockwood, who had no other options, agreed. Chaffee went to work immediately, designing the intake and canal system himself. On May 14, 1901, the first water was turned into the canal at a headgate near Pilot Knob, just above the Mexican border. By June, water from the Colorado River was reaching the Imperial Valley through a 54-mile canal that ran south into Mexico, then north across the border through the dry bed of the Alamo River. Chaffee's reputation was enough to bring settlers. Within 8 months, 2,000 people had arrived. 5 towns were surveyed. 400 miles of canals and distribution laterals were dug. 100,000 acres were readied for planting. Before Chaffee, settlers in this corner of the desert had to haul drinking water by rail from the Coachella Valley. Now they had a river at their command. Chaffee renamed the valley from the bleak Salton Sink to the aspirational Imperial Valley. The desert was blooming. By 1909, 15,000 people would be farming 160,000 irrigated acres. But Rockwood never liked sharing power. By 1902, he had acquired enough company stock to force Chaffee out, buying his shares and taking back control. It was a decision that would matter enormously, because the canal system Chaffee had designed relied on a temporary wooden headgate near Pilot Knob that controlled how much river water entered the system. Almost immediately, the Colorado began filling the canal with silt. The river carried one of the highest sediment loads of any waterway in the world. By late 1904, the silt had rendered the main canal nearly useless. Farmers were watching their crops die. The company was hemorrhaging money. People were threatening lawsuits. That's when Rockwood made his gamble. Rather than fix the silted intake on the American side of the border, which would have required War Department approval he'd already been denied, he ordered the cut through the Mexican bank of the river, 4 miles downstream. No headgate, no control structure, just an open wound in the river's side, hoping the water would behave. For a few months it did. Water flowed into the canals. Crops revived. Rockwood must have thought he'd solved his problem. Then the winter rains came. In the spring of 1905, 5 floods hit the lower Colorado River in rapid succession. Each one surged through Rockwood's unprotected cut. The first flood widened the breach to 150 feet. Attempts to dam it with brush and sandbags failed. By summer, the opening was more than half a mile wide, and the entire volume of the Colorado River, 14,000 cubic feet per second, was pouring not into the Gulf of California, where it had flowed for millennia, but northwest into the Salton Sea. The water carved new rivers as it went. A waterfall formed at the head of the breach, initially 15 feet high. As the current ate through the soft desert alluvium, the waterfall grew, 20 feet, then 40, then 80. The erosion was so violent that the engineer Harry Corey later calculated that the runaway water had carved away a volume of earth almost 4 times greater than the entire Panama Canal. The town of Salton, a Southern Pacific Railroad siding, went under. The new Liverpool Salt Company, which had been mining salt from the basin since 1883, harvesting 700 tons of pure crystal per day with Indian labor and a miniature railroad, watched its entire operation disappear beneath rising water. A visitor to the salt works in 1902 had described the site as thousands of tons piled up like huge snowdrifts. Indians operating cable plows, a portable railroad conveying the crystal harvest from a lake that was constantly being replenished by mineral springs. All of it gone now, swallowed by muddy river water. Half of the Torres Martinez Desert Cahuilla Indian Reservation, established in 1876, was submerged. The Cahuilla, whose ancestors had lived around an ancient version of this same lake 1,000 years earlier, packed their belongings and moved into the mountains. The Southern Pacific's main line through the desert was flooded, its tracks twisted and washed out. On a scorching July day in 1905, the rising water swamped the railroad for good. And that last detail is what turned a regional disaster into a national drama. The Southern Pacific Railroad had tracks running through the Salton Sea, and its president, Edward Henry Harriman, one of the most powerful men in American industry, was not going to let a rogue river destroy his railroad. Rockwood, broke and desperate, went to New York to beg Harriman for help. Harriman agreed to fund the effort to close the breach on the condition that the Southern Pacific would essentially take over the California Development Company. Rockwood became chief engineer of his own, now captive company. He stayed through 1906, then left. What followed was one of the great engineering battles in American history, and almost nobody remembers it. Harriman threw the full force of the Southern Pacific at the Colorado River. All other operations of the railroad, except for one, became subordinate to closing the gap. That one exception was the San Francisco earthquake and fire of April 1906, which diverted Southern Pacific resources to Northern California at the worst possible moment. Equipment stockpiled in San Francisco for the river fight, including a massive clamshell dredge, was stranded in the devastated city. There were serious doubts that Harriman could fight 2 disasters at once. He did. Pile bridges were built across the breach. Trains were diverted from 1,200 miles of the railroad's main line. 3,000 flat cars hauled rock and fill from quarries as far as 480 miles away. Indian workers, nearly 2,000 men, women, and children from 6 tribes, camped on the Arizona bank and worked for 20 cents an hour, with an additional man's pay going to a woman who cooked for every group of 9 laborers. They bought their own supplies and, to avoid paying duty at the border, built their camps on the Arizona side, crossing the dry channel below the breach to get to work each morning. In November 1906, the crews managed to force the river back into its channel. It lasted exactly 1 month. In December, the Gila River sent floodwaters into the Colorado, blowing open the breach again. Harriman exchanged telegrams with President Theodore Roosevelt, who offered vague assurances that he would recommend Congress reimburse the railroad. The reimbursement would never fully materialize. The railroad went back to work. This time, they built 2 trestles across the 1,100-foot gap and began dumping rock faster than the river could sweep it away. In 15 days, they dumped 80,000 cubic yards of stone and fill. On February 11, 1907, the breach was sealed. By then, California's largest lake existed where none had been planned. The Salton Sea sat at 195 feet below sea level, covered more than 350 square miles, and contained roughly the volume that the Colorado River would have sent to the Gulf of California over those 2 years. The California Development Company was bankrupt. The Imperial Irrigation District, formed by Valley farmers in 1911, would eventually buy out all the company's assets. And the Salton Sea, this enormous accidental body of water, should have simply evaporated and disappeared. In that desert heat, with no river feeding it and no outlet draining it, the lake would have shrunk to nothing within a few decades. But here is where the story takes its strange turn, the one that makes everything else possible. The Imperial Valley was still being farmed, and farmed more aggressively than ever. Flood irrigation, the method of simply pouring water over fields and letting it flow across the soil, was the standard practice. And all that excess water, after it had dissolved salts and minerals from the earth, after it had picked up traces of whatever the farmers had put down, ran downhill. Downhill, in the Imperial Valley, meant into the Salton Sea. The lake that was never supposed to exist was being kept alive by the very agriculture that had accidentally created it. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the sea settled into a kind of equilibrium. The Hoover Dam, completed in 1936, and the Imperial Dam, completed in 1938, ended the wild floods that had occasionally swept through the valley, which meant less spectacular inflow. But the steady drip of farm runoff continued. The water stayed. In 1930, the federal government established the Salton Sea Wildlife Refuge on the lake's southern shore, recognizing that the accidental sea had become a critical stop on the Pacific Flyway, the migratory route stretching from Alaska to Patagonia. More than 400 species of birds, pelicans, grebes, cormorants, egrets, were stopping at this improbable oasis in the middle of the desert. The wildlife refuge was a formal acknowledgement. The mistake was now a feature. Then someone introduced fish. The California Department of Fish and Game began stocking the Salton Sea in the 1930s, and after several failed attempts with species that couldn't tolerate the conditions, populations of orange-mouth corvina, Gulf croaker, sargo, and tilapia began to thrive in the early 1950s. Within a few years, the fish numbers were staggering. Estimates would eventually reach 100 million. The fishing was extraordinary. And that's when the developers arrived. The man who saw it most clearly was M. Penn Phillips, a 70-year-old real estate operator from Kansas who had spent decades subdividing cheap desert land across the American West. Phillips had a formula. Buy remote acreage for almost nothing, plat it into lots, build just enough infrastructure to make the brochures look good, and sell before anyone noticed what wasn't there. He'd done it in Hesperia, in the high desert above San Bernardino, where he partnered with boxer Jack Dempsey and poured $8.25 million into roads and lot sales. He'd done it with ranches near Palmdale and tracts in the Las Vegas basin. Now he turned his eye to the Salton Sea. In 1957, Phillips acquired 19,600 acres along the western shore of the lake. He paid less than $2 an acre. He hired Albert Frey, the Swiss-born modernist architect who had studied under Le Corbusier, who had helped design the Museum of Modern Art in New York, who had become the founding father of desert modernism in Palm Springs, to draw up plans for an entire city. Frey designed a business district, schools, churches, parks, an 18-hole championship golf course, a $500,000 luxury hotel, and a yacht club and marina. Phillips mapped 25,000 residential lots and built 250 miles of paved roads. He called it Salton City, and his brochures promised the miracle Salton City by the Desert Sea, Southern California's most famous resort. The opening day was May 21st, 1958. Phillips brought in busloads of prospective buyers from Los Angeles. He staged boat races on the sea and invited Guy Lombardo, Jack Dempsey, Groucho Marx, Jerry Lewis, and Frank Sinatra to lend their names. Nearly half the crowd, some said, were real estate salesmen. It didn't matter. The acre lots Phillips had bought for under $2 sold for $3,000 each. On that single day, Phillips closed $4.25 million in sales. By 1964, some $20 million had been spent developing the community, and 15,000 lots had been sold. On the northeastern shore, a parallel drama unfolded. Developers Ray Ryan, an oil millionaire, and Trav Rogers began building North Shore in 1958. They commissioned Albert Frey again, and Frey designed the North Shore Beach and Yacht Club, a building shaped like a ship with a curved prow, porthole windows, pipe railings, and a central mast, all rendered in his signature palette of sand-colored concrete block, corrugated metal, and yellow fiberglass panels. It opened in 1962 as the centerpiece of a $2 million development that included what was then one of the largest marinas in Southern California. The cocktail lounge overlooked the water. Boats bobbed in the harbor. Frank Sinatra played there. The Beach Boys, Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin, the Marx Brothers, Bing Crosby, Desi Arnaz, Rock Hudson. They all came. Sonny Bono learned to water ski on the Salton Sea. The region was billed as the Salton Riviera, and promoters called it Palm Springs by the Sea. Up and down the shoreline, smaller operations bloomed. The Salton Bay Yacht Club, the Desert Shores Yacht Club with its five-fingered marina and a fishing barge anchored just offshore. Star-filled nightclubs with names like the Ace and Spades and the 500 Club. Motels and restaurants and bait shops and boat rental operations sprung up along every accessible stretch of shore. At Bombay Beach, on the eastern shore, a community of vacation homes and small businesses took shape at 225 feet below sea level, one of the lowest elevation settlements in the Western Hemisphere. At the Ski Inn, which opened there in the 1950s, vacationers started a tradition of writing their names on dollar bills and tacking them to every wall and ceiling. The bills are still there. At its peak, the Salton Sea drew more than 1.5 million visitors a year. That was more than Yosemite National Park. Consider for a moment what that means. An accidental lake, born of one engineer's shortcut and sustained entirely by farm waste, had become the most visited recreational body of water in California. The shoreline was white and gleaming. The water was blue, or appeared to be, reflecting the enormous desert sky. The fishing was sensational. The cost of a vacation home was a fraction of what you'd pay in Palm Springs, just an hour to the north. Everything about the place seemed like a miracle, and the word was used constantly in brochures and newspaper features and the names of businesses. A miracle in the desert. But the miracle had a flaw engineered into it from the beginning, and it was the same flaw that had created the sea in the first place. Nobody had built a gate. The Salton Sea is what hydrologists call an endorheic lake, a body of water with no outlet. Water flows in but cannot flow out. It can only evaporate. And when water evaporates, it leaves behind everything it was carrying: salt, minerals, selenium, boron, pesticides, fertilizers, DDT. Every gallon of irrigation runoff that entered the Salton Sea deposited its chemical payload and then departed as clean vapor, leaving the soup a little thicker than before. The mechanism was simple and relentless. Fresh water was pumped out of the lake to irrigate fields, where it dissolved salts from the soil. Then the excess flowed back to the lake to be pumped out again. Each cycle concentrated the minerals a little more. 4 million tons of dissolved salts entered the lake every year. None left. The salinity climbed slowly through the 1950s, accelerated through the 1960s, and by the early 1970s had reached levels that alarmed biologists. The California Department of Fish and Game predicted, as early as the 1960s, that the sea would eventually die by 1980 or 1990 if nothing was done about the salt. Diking systems were proposed to isolate parts of the lake and reduce salinity. Studies were commissioned. Reports were written. Nothing was done about the salt. And the pesticides weren't the worst of it. The lake was also receiving sewage from Mexicali across the border through the New River, at one point considered the most polluted river in North America. And then the storms came. In September 1976, Hurricane Kathleen roared up the Baja California Peninsula and struck the Imperial Valley with devastating rainfall. The Salton Sea rose to record levels, spilling over its edges, flooding vacation homes, swamping marinas, drowning the very infrastructure that Phillips and Ryan and Rogers had built. Less than a year later, Hurricane Doreen followed. The 1-2 punch was catastrophic. The resorts along the shoreline, the places where Sinatra had played, where the Beach Boys had docked their boat, where families had built modest vacation cottages, were wrecked. The water destroyed the jetty at North Shore. Boats could no longer dock at Frey's beautiful yacht club. The visitors didn't come back. Between the flooding and the rising salinity and the growing stench, hydrogen sulfide produced by algae blooms, smelling like rotten eggs, drifting for miles, the Salton Riviera was finished. By the early 1980s, the water was saltier than the Pacific Ocean. By 1984, the North Shore Beach and Yacht Club closed for good. The glamorous building with its porthole windows and its cocktail lounge overlooking the marina sat abandoned, vandalized, its swimming pool filled with dust. And then the dying began in earnest. The rising salt was killing the fish. Not quickly and not cleanly, but in waves. The algae blooms, fed by fertilizer runoff, would explode in the summer heat, consume all the oxygen in the water, and suffocate millions of fish at once. Their bodies washed ashore and rotted in the sun. In the winter of 1991 and 1992, 150,000 eared grebes, small diving birds that stopped at the Salton Sea on their migration, died. A researcher named Robert Boyle, writing for the Smithsonian, reported that surviving grebes were so disoriented they sat motionless while gulls attacked and ate them alive. In 1994, 20,000 more grebes died. Then came 1996, and the worst single wildlife disaster the region had ever seen. Over a 4-month period, 14,000 birds perished from avian botulism, nearly 10,000 of them American white pelicans. More than 1,000 endangered brown pelicans died in what was described as the largest reported die-off of an endangered species in the United States. Workers burned the carcasses in an incinerator that ran 24 hours a day for weeks. The news coverage was devastating. Images of dead birds carpeting the shoreline, the lake presented as a toxic wasteland. One person who paid attention was Sonny Bono, the former pop star, the shorter, self-deprecating half of Sonny and Cher, the man who had topped the charts with I Got You, Babe, had reinvented himself as a politician with characteristic bluntness. He'd become mayor of Palm Springs in 1988 after getting frustrated with the bureaucratic hassle of putting up a new sign at the Italian restaurant he owned. He won a seat in Congress in 1994, representing California's 44th district, which included a large stretch of the Salton Sea's shoreline. Bono, who had learned to water ski on the sea as a young man, was furious at the neglect. In 1995, he formed a congressional Salton Sea task force and began pushing for federal restoration money. He was blunt, outspoken, and, perhaps because he wasn't a career politician, willing to say plainly that the Salton Sea was dying and that Congress was ignoring it. His advocacy was gaining traction. Then, on January 5, 1998, Bono skied into a tree at the Heavenly Ski Resort near Lake Tahoe and died from massive head injuries. He was 62. His widow, Mary Bono, won his congressional seat and continued the fight. Later that year, Congress passed the Salton Sea Reclamation Act, named for Sonny, and President Clinton signed it into law. It authorized environmental studies and laid the groundwork for restoration. It felt, for a moment, like the sea might be saved. But the timing was terrible. The studies were barely underway when the September 11th attacks redirected every ounce of federal attention and funding. Priorities shifted. The Salton Sea, once again, was an afterthought. And then, in 2003, a deal was struck that many scientists believe sealed the lake's fate. The Quantification Settlement Agreement, the largest agricultural-to-urban water transfer in American history, committed the Imperial Irrigation District to send up to 200,000 acre-feet of Colorado River water per year to the San Diego County Water Authority for 75 years. The water would come from conservation. Farmers would use less, line their canals, fallow fields, all of which meant less runoff into the Salton Sea. Annual inflow was projected to drop from 1.2 million acre-feet to somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000. The deal included a provision to send mitigation water to the sea through 2017, a 15-year stopgap while California figured out a long-term restoration plan. California never figured out a long-term restoration plan. The state had passed a Salton Sea Restoration Act alongside the QSA, declaring its intent to restore the ecosystem and permanently protect the wildlife that depended on it. But the act was a statement of intent, not a funding mechanism. Year after year, the restoration was studied, debated, deferred. Plans were drawn up and shelved. Meanwhile, the clock ran. The mitigation water stopped on schedule at the end of 2017. The sea began to shrink in earnest. By 2023, it had lost roughly 25 square miles of surface area since the QSA was signed. Projections suggested that by 2038, the Salton Sea would lose 35% of its surface and 60% of its volume. What happens when an endorheic lake loses a third of its inflow is not subtle. The water recedes, the shoreline retreats, and the lake bed that emerges, called playa, is not ordinary dry ground. It is a crust of salt, selenium, arsenic, pesticide residue, and fine particulate matter that has been accumulating at the bottom of a toxic lake for over a century. When the wind blows across that playa, and in the desert the wind always blows, it lifts that material into the air. By one estimate, the loss of inflow from the water transfer increased wind-blown dust by 40 to 80 additional tons per day. The communities downwind are among the poorest in California. Imperial County, where most of the Salton Sea's southern shore sits, is predominantly Latino, predominantly low income, and already has some of the worst air quality in the country. Its air already fails federal standards, even without the additional dust from the receding lake. It also has the highest rate of asthma-related emergency room visits for children in the state. Luis Olmedo, executive director of a community organization called Comité Cívico del Valle, has been sounding the alarm for years. His group helped install a network of 40 air monitoring devices across the Imperial Valley to track what the residents were breathing. "We shouldn't have this level of asthma," he told researchers. "It is a crisis. It's an emergency." In 2017, researchers from the University of California began a study called AIRE, Assessing Imperial Valley Respiratory Health and the Environment, tracking more than 700 elementary school children in 5 communities near the Salton Sea. Nearly 1 in 5 children had asthma, far above the national average. The study, published in the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine, found a direct measurable link between wind-blown dust events from the receding lake bed and reduced lung function. The children living closest to the shoreline were the most affected. Researchers drew parallels to the Dust Bowl pneumonia of the 1930s. Those children started the study as first graders. They are in high school now. By 2019, a report estimated that 20 years earlier, there had been 100 million fish in the Salton Sea. More than 97% were gone. The orange-mouthed corvina, the prized game fish that had drawn anglers from across the state, had vanished entirely by 2003. Only tilapia hung on, and barely. In the summer of 1999, 8 million tilapia had died in a single day, suffocated by an algae bloom that consumed all the oxygen in the water. The pelicans and cormorants and grebes that had once darkened the sky above the sea were disappearing. By 2017, birdwatchers reported that most of them were simply gone. Penn Phillips Salton City still exists after a fashion. About 3,000 people live there. The 250 miles of paved roads he built still stretch across the desert, most of them serving nothing. A grid designed for 40,000 residents, 92% empty. You can drive for miles down perfectly paved streets with curbs and utility hookups and see nothing but creosote bush and sand. The lots that sold for $3,000 on opening day in 1958 can be had today for a few thousand, some for a few hundred. One recent listing offered a quarter-acre lot on a paved road with water and sewer at the street for $13,000. Phillips himself had sold his interest in the development by the early 1960s and moved on to subdividing 72,000 acres of desert in Oregon's Lake County, where he built an A-frame lodge, a 9-hole golf course, and an airstrip, and promised a community of 5,000. It never materialized either. He died in 1979 at 91, having never looked back at any of them. In May 1960, the California Department of Real Estate had charged him with fraud in connection with land sales in Hesperia, temporarily suspending his broker's license. The charges specified 18 instances of deceptive sales practices, including promises of income-producing rental units that could never be built under the existing zoning. A colleague once recalled Phillips telling him, "Your problem is that you fall in love with the property. What you do is buy the land, build on it, sell it, and get out." It was the same playbook across decades and states. Buy cheap, sell the dream, leave before the dream fell apart. Of the roughly 200 modest homes built in Salton City by 1966, most were abandoned within 20 years. Albert Frey's North Shore Beach and Yacht Club, the ship-shaped modernist jewel with its curved prow pointing toward a marina that no longer existed and its porthole windows staring out at a shoreline that had retreated beyond recognition, sat derelict for a quarter century, vandalized and exposed to the elements. The North Shore Motel just next door was demolished in 2008. In 2007, the rock band Lincoln Park photographed it for the cover of their album, using the abandoned building and the rotting shoreline as a backdrop. It was an image of American ruin, as evocative in its way as any photograph of Detroit. In 2009, Riverside County secured a $3.5 million grant to restore the building. Today, it serves as a community center. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2015. The marina it was built to serve no longer exists. The water has retreated so far from the building that the shoreline is barely visible from where the cocktail lounge used to be. But the Salton Sea, as it has done at every turn in its accidental existence, refuses to follow the script. In late 2023, the U.S. Department of Energy confirmed what geologists had suspected. Beneath the Salton Sea lies one of the largest lithium brine deposits in the world. An estimated 18 million metric tons of lithium, the critical mineral that powers the batteries in electric vehicles, laptops, and grid-scale energy storage, sits dissolved in the superheated geothermal brine hundreds of feet below the lake bed. The estimated value? $540 billion. They are calling it Lithium Valley. Berkshire Hathaway Energy Renewables, which already operates 10 of the 11 geothermal plants in the Salton Sea area, is developing pilot lithium extraction facilities. General Motors invested millions in a project called Hell's Kitchen, being built by Controlled Thermal Resources, which plans a 7-phase extraction operation. The technology is called direct lithium extraction. Hot brine is pumped up, geothermal energy is generated, lithium is separated, and the spent brine is re-injected. The companies promise a closed-loop process with no waste and no emissions. Environmental groups have filed lawsuits. Community advocates point out that the people who live downwind of the sea, the same people whose children have the highest childhood asthma rates in the state, were not the ones who made the water deals, were not the ones who profited from the land speculation, and may not be the ones who benefit from the lithium. The Salton Sea has gone, in 120 years, from an ancient dry lake bed where Indians mined salt, to an engineering catastrophe, to an accidental paradise, to a speculative bonanza, to an ecological disaster, to a public health crisis, to what may be America's most strategically important mineral deposit. Each chapter was shaped by someone making a bet. Wozencraft betting on the soil, Rockwood betting on the canal, Phillips betting on the lots, the water agencies betting that San Diego's thirst mattered more than a dying lake. Each bet paid off for the person who made it, at least for a while. The costs landed somewhere else, on the Cahuilla who lost their reservation, on the buyers who lost their investments, on the birds that lost their flyway, on the children who lost their breath. The shoreline of the Salton Sea is white, not the white of sand, the white of crushed fish bones and barnacle shells, compacted into a crust that crunches underfoot like broken porcelain. Here and there, the skeleton of a tilapia lies fully intact, baked by the sun into something that looks almost ceramic. The smell, on a calm day, is bearable. On a windy day, it is not. The water, from a distance, still appears blue, still reflects the enormous sky the way it did when Frank Sinatra stood at the bar in the yacht club and watched the boats come in. But the water is brown at the edge, and the edge is farther from the buildings than it used to be, and the buildings are farther from what anyone would call habitable than they used to be. Somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the salt crust and the playa dust and the dead fish and the broken concrete of the marinas, 18 million metric tons of lithium wait in the dark, in brine that has been heating since before Rockwood picked up a shovel.